He once said failed marriages are the ones where two people stay together long after they have stopped caring. So why, at 86 years old, is Paul Hogan still talking about Linda Kozlowski like she is unfinished business? They were the accidental Hollywood power couple, born directly out of a movie script. 23 years of marriage, one son, and one of the messiest public divorces Australia has ever watched play out. Yet, decades later, Hogan is the one picking up the phone to call her. It is not for romance, but for something far more urgent. What actually broke this marriage was never about love running dry. It was about two people who wanted completely different lives and did not find that out until it was too late to fix. The reason he is calling her now, in 2026, might be the part of this story nobody saw coming. Go back to 1985, when Paul Hogan was 45 years old and tired of being famous only in Australia. He had already clawed his way out of a job as a rigger on the Sydney Harbour Bridge and built a sketch comedy show that turned him into a household name. But he decided none of that was enough anymore. He wanted Hollywood. So he co-wrote a film about a rugged bushman from the outback, put his own money behind it, and cast a 27-year-old Juilliard-trained actress named Linda Kozlowski to play the American journalist who falls for him on screen. But here is the detail most retellings skip straight past. Hogan was still married. His wife, Nolene, had stood beside him since 1958, through 5 children and one earlier separation they had already patched up. While cameras rolled out in the Australian bush, something between Hogan and his new co-star stopped feeling like acting fairly quickly. People on set noticed the spark before either of them said a word out loud. It was not just the chemistry that was unusual, because plenty of co-stars have chemistry. What was unusual was how fast it stopped staying on the page. Crocodile Dundee hit theaters in 1986 and became a genuine phenomenon, pulling in over $300 million worldwide. Hogan became an overnight name in America. Back home, though, his marriage was falling apart in full public view. He filed for divorce from Nolene that same year, and Australian papers tore into him without mercy. It turned into one of the messiest celebrity splits the country had seen in years, dragged through headline after headline while Hogan was simultaneously becoming a global star on the other side of the world. 4 years later, in 1990, he married Kozlowski. To fans, it looked like absolute fate. Two people who fell for each other on screen, then simply made it real. What got buried underneath that fairy tale framing was a basic fact nobody wanted to print out loud. This was not two single people finding each other by chance. It was a brand new marriage built directly on top of one that had just been torn down. Foundations like that tend to carry a weight nobody on the outside can actually see, but what happens when that weight finally becomes too much to hold? Linda did not marry an ordinary man. She married someone whose entire identity, professionally and financially, was tied permanently to one character. For a while, she leaned into that fully, co-starring with him again in Crocodile Dundee 2 in a film called Almost an Angel, playing essentially the same role on screen that she now played off it as well. By the early 90s, the couple had settled into life as one of Hollywood's most recognizable pairs, photographed everywhere and written about constantly. But here is where it actually gets interesting, because most people stop the story right there. Kozlowski had trained at Juilliard and performed Death of a Salesman on Broadway. That is the kind of serious theater work most actresses spend an entire career chasing. She was not pursuing fame for its own sake, she was pursuing craft. Craft simply was not what Hollywood was offering the wife of Crocodile Dundee. She later admitted, plainly and without much bitterness, that most of the scripts sent her way reduced her to the girlfriend of whatever comic lead the studio had cast that year. One project even gave her actual ulcers from how badly it was run behind the scenes. By 2001, after a final Crocodile Dundee sequel set in Los Angeles, she quietly stopped acting altogether. There was no big announcement. She just stopped. People assume walking away from acting was simply Linda's choice, full stop, end of story. It was not nearly that clean. In 1998, she gave birth to their son, Chance, at the age of 40. She said outright at the time that she wanted a child before it was too late, and that having Chance made her happier than her last 2 film jobs combined ever had. That part was completely real, and worth sitting with for a second, because it means the early motherhood years genuinely were not the problem. What is also real is what friends later described once the marriage started fraying at the edges. Kozlowski felt boxed into a domestic role she had not fully signed up for, watching her own identity quietly dissolve into being known only as Hogan's wife. Hogan, for his part, simply was not built to express things in soft language. He believed providing financially and staying loyal covered the whole job description of being a husband. He was not wrong that he did those two things consistently for over 2 decades. He was wrong about whether that was ever going to be enough for a woman who had trained at Juilliard and once stood on a Broadway stage. They had two completely different definitions of love, sitting in the same house for 20 years, never quite translating to each other. By 2013, something had to give. In October of that year, Kozlowski filed for divorce in a Los Angeles court, citing irreconcilable differences. That is the same dry legal phrase that ends thousands of marriages every year without explaining a single one of them honestly. She was 55, and Hogan was 74. Their son Chance was 15 at the time, old enough to feel the shift happening in the house without fully understanding the weight of it yet. The split was finalized the following year, and the settlement told its own story without either of them saying a word publicly. Hogan kept full rights to the Crocodile Dundee character and the production company behind the franchise, the one piece of the marriage that had nothing to do with Linda at all from the start. She walked away with a lump sum just over $5 million, no spousal support, shared custody of Chance, and permission to stay in their Venice Beach home for a few more years. 23 years, compressed down into a single court filing. There was no scandal buried in that paperwork. No affair, no betrayal, no villain. Just two people who had quietly drifted into separate lives years before either of them said it out loud. And that, it turns out, is exactly the kind of ending that sets up a crisis nobody expected over a decade later. Hogan never once described the split as some dramatic betrayal. In an interview years later, he called it simply worn out, comparing 23 years to a quarter century that started electric and slowly went flat over time. He said he and Linda were opposites in nearly everything: the food they liked, the music, even the colors they were drawn to. Those differences were exactly what pulled them together at the start and pushed them apart by the end. Kozlowski's version, given to New Idea magazine, was almost gentle by comparison. She said she had lived in Paul's shadow for years and that it finally felt good to feel her own light again. Neither of them painted the other as the villain in any of it, which is actually rarer than the tabloid headlines from that era made it sound. That is exactly why so many people assumed there had to be a darker story hiding underneath the calm explanations. But there was not one. There were just 2 decades of slowly growing apart in silence, and a divorce that finally said out loud what both of them had known for years. After the divorce, Kozlowski did not fade into quiet retirement the way the public probably expected. She started splitting her time between Los Angeles and Morocco, where she met a tour operator named Moulay Hafid Baba. Together they built a travel company offering luxury tours and film location scouting, and she married him in 2017. She also turned out to be sharper with money than anyone gave her credit for. She took part of her settlement and invested it into Venice Beach property during the exact years the neighborhood became known as a magnet for tech wealth. She earned a fierce reputation among neighbors as someone who knew exactly what she was doing with every dollar. She quietly built real, independent money for the first time in her adult life, on terms nobody else set for her. Hogan stayed in Los Angeles. He kept the Venice Beach house, and he kept Chance close. While Linda was building a second act nobody predicted, Hogan spent years buried in something far less glamorous. Starting in 2003, the Australian Taxation Office opened an investigation into Hogan and his financial team over millions allegedly funneled through offshore accounts. The case became known publicly as Operation Wickenby, and it dragged on for 7 brutal years. In 2010, while Hogan was back in Australia for his own mother's funeral, he was hit with a departure prohibition order. This legally barred him from leaving the country until the matter was resolved, with the alleged debt cited at over 37 million Australian dollars. He compared the experience publicly to dealing with the Taliban. The charges were eventually dropped that same year, and a confidential settlement followed in 2012, but the years of scrutiny left a deep mark on his reputation that never fully went away. By his 80s, the physical toll became impossible to hide from cameras. Hogan developed a benign growth that wrapped around his abdominal aorta and pressed directly on his kidney, a condition called retroperitoneal fibrosis. The treatment for it turned out to be almost as brutal as the diagnosis itself. He was put on steroid treatment to shrink the growth, and the side effects shrank his muscles and stripped his body fat so badly he said he could eat anything he wanted, fatty food, fried food, whatever he liked, and still not put weight back on. He has joked that friends of his on strict diets actually resent him for it, since he gets to eat everything they are not allowed to and never gains an ounce. But the reality behind the jokes was much darker. He ended up needing a pacemaker fitted on top of everything else. In one interview, he described the whole experience bluntly, saying the muscles all shrank and the strength never fully came back, leaving him feeling feeble in a way he never expected at that stage of his life. He has openly admitted he needs his son to open jars for him now, because his grip simply is not what it used to be. He also said something that stuck with people who had watched him for decades, that staying genuinely fit and strong all the way up until he turned 79 had been a real blessing, and that he could have outlifted most men half his age right up until that point. Turning 80, in his own words, is when things actually started falling apart. In 2025, photos surfaced of Hogan being wheeled through Sydney Airport, and the internet immediately assumed the worst, fearing some kind of medical emergency. He addressed it directly in an interview, explaining it was arthritis combined with a knee injury from skateboarding, a hobby he apparently still refuses to give up well into his 80s. He laughed the whole moment off publicly, joking about it the same way he always has. But those close to him say privately that the laughing has gotten noticeably harder to keep up the last couple of years. One health scare after another has chipped away at the rugged image that made him famous in the first place, but a physical decline was nothing compared to the emotional storm brewing under his own roof. Chance, now 27 and fronting a punk band, has struggled for years with mental health and substance issues that occasionally spilled into public view. Just last year, he posted a video to social media openly begging for someone to end his life, a heartbreaking moment that alarmed fans and reportedly devastated his father. Hogan, frustrated with how tabloids covered his son, once pushed back hard against the negative headlines, insisting Chance was actually a hero in his own right for trying to carve out his own path despite everything stacked against him. That defense got harder to maintain in May of this year. Police were called to Hogan's Venice Beach home around 10:30 in the morning over a reported domestic disturbance involving possible violence. Chance had already left the property before officers arrived, but he was tracked down hours later and arrested on a domestic battery charge, with bail set at $20,000. An unidentified woman was seen at the scene speaking with officers alongside Hogan himself, though it was never made clear who exactly was involved in the incident or what set it off. The Los Angeles Police Department later said it could not release further details, citing confidentiality rules around domestic battery cases specifically. For Hogan, this was not a tabloid moment to brush off with a quick joke the way he had handled the wheelchair photos. It was apparent at 86 watching his last remaining child at home unravel in front of him in real time. Reports suggest Chance has a long history of struggles that go back years, including troubling behavior at home that worried people close to the family long before police ever got involved. Sources close to the family say Hogan was visibly shaken, described by one insider as simply tired, someone who at 86 should not have to be dealing with a crisis like this on top of everything his own body has already put him through. What he did next is the part that actually matters here. He immediately reached out to Kozlowski, the same woman he divorced over a decade earlier, asking for her help getting Chance into treatment and figuring out what comes next. Whatever distance had lingered after the split apparently evaporated the moment their son needed both of them in the same room again. That is the call from the beginning of our story. That is what 86-year-old Paul Hogan picked up the phone for, not to revisit old wounds, but to face a brand new one neither of them saw coming. People want this story to end with Hogan and Kozlowski falling back in love, especially after the two of them reunited publicly in 2025 for a remastered 4K re-release of the original Crocodile Dundee, alongside a brand new behind-the-scenes documentary about the making of the film. For fans, it played like a nostalgic gift, a chance to see the original Mick and Sue standing side by side again after decades apart. For Paul and Linda, reportedly, it carried far more weight than that. By this point, Hogan was 85 and visibly frail, and people close to the project said it genuinely gave him a new sense of purpose, a reason to revisit not just the film that built his entire career, but the relationship that shaped the rest of his personal life as well. Chance, supportive of the project despite everything else going on in his own life at the time, called it meaningful to see his parents working together again after years of distance between them. It was, by most accounts, a genuinely warm moment for a family that had spent over a decade living on opposite sides of an ocean in a divorce settlement. But that reunion was never about rekindling anything romantic. and Hogan has been honest about that distinction every time it has come up. By his own admission, he has made peace with loving Linda deeply while also accepting that sometimes love simply is not enough to keep two people in the same house for the rest of their lives. He has said as much directly, describing it almost like an epitaph for the whole marriage rather than a door left open. What is pulling them back into each other's orbit now is not nostalgia for 1986, and it is not unfinished romantic business either. It is two aging parents on opposite sides of the world, one building a new life in Morocco with her husband, the other still living in the same Venice beach house they once shared, trying together to save the one thing that survived their marriage when absolutely nothing else did.